Photographs from the 1880s show metal structures rising 300 meters into the sky across continents. Official records call them telegraph poles, but telegraph poles don't require foundations deeper than modern skyscrapers. They don't appear on maps labeled as aerial routes, and they certainly don't vanish from every major city within a 3-year period starting in 1902. I've spent months tracing these structures through archives, patent offices, and newspaper clippings that contradict everything we're taught about transportation history. What you're about to see isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a documentation gap so systematic that it raises questions about what transportation technology actually existed before the 20th century. By the end of this investigation, you'll see 8 specific patterns that don't fit the standard narrative, complete with locations, dates, and sources you can verify yourself. Let's start with what these structures actually looked like and why their official explanation makes no engineering sense. The first time I saw the photograph, I assumed it was fake. The image, dated 1893, shows a metal lattice tower in downtown Chicago, roughly 30 stories tall, with what appears to be a platform structure at the top. The caption in the Chicago Tribune archive reads, "Metropolitan Aerial Telegraph Station, Michigan Avenue." I pulled the building permits for that address. The structure required a foundation rated for locomotive weight, not telegraph equipment. This wasn't an isolated case. Similar photographs exist for Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, all from the 1880s and 90s. Each tower shares identical characteristics: massive iron construction, platforms at heights between 250 and 350 meters, and foundation work that engineering manuals from that era describe as suitable for heavy rail transit. But according to official history, these were simply telegraph relay stations. The problem is the math. A telegraph relay station in 1890 required approximately 200 kilograms of equipment. These foundations were rated for loads exceeding 50,000 kilograms, 25 times what any telegraph system would need. When I cross-referenced this with contemporary engineering journals, I found something strange. The American Society of Civil Engineers published a paper in 1895 titled "Load-Bearing Requirements for Elevated Transit Terminals." The specifications match these so-called telegraph stations exactly. Then there are the maps. I found a commercial railway map from 1892 in the Library of Congress, published by Rand McNally. In the legend, alongside standard railroad symbols, there's a dotted line marked "Atmospheric Routes, Seasonal Service." These dotted lines connect major cities at what the map scale suggests are elevations above typical terrain: Philadelphia to Boston, Chicago to Detroit, St. Louis to Kansas City. When I plotted these routes against the locations of the mysterious tall towers, they aligned with a margin of error under 5 kilometers. But here's where it gets interesting. Every single one of these maps was revised by 1903. The new editions removed the atmospheric route designation entirely. No explanation, no errata notice, just gone. I contacted Rand McNally's Historical Archives Department to ask about this change. They confirmed the symbol existed in earlier editions, but had no documentation explaining why it was removed or what it originally represented. Newspaper accounts from the 1890s add another layer. The San Francisco Chronicle from 1894 contains an advertisement for elevated atmospheric transit, Chicago to Milwaukee, 3 hours direct. 3 hours to cover roughly 150 kilometers suggests an average speed of 50 kilometers per hour, which was impossible for ground-based steam rail of that era on that route due to terrain and stops. The advertisement lists departure points from Union Atmospheric Terminal, Lake Street, elevation. That address, when I checked property records, corresponds to one of those massive tower structures. I started finding references in unexpected places. A society column from the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1896 mentions a woman traveling via the aerial line to attend a wedding in New York, noting she preferred the elevated route despite the additional fare due to the smoothness of transit. The Boston Globe from 1898 complains about noise from the atmospheric engines disturbing residents near Park Street. where, you guessed it, another tower stood. What makes this particularly puzzling is the silence after 1900. These references simply stop, not gradually, but abruptly. I searched newspapers from 1903 onward for any mention of atmospheric transit, aerial routes, or elevated rail beyond standard elevated trains. Nothing. The terminology vanishes from public discourse within months. Academic papers from the period show a similar pattern. Between 1885 and 1900, at least 12 engineering papers discuss atmospheric propulsion systems and elevated rail via magnetic suspension. These papers appear in journals from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and similar British and German organizations. After 1902, the topic disappears. I contacted several engineering history departments to ask about this shift. 3 professors responded, all noting the same gap, but attributing it to the rise of electric streetcars, making other technologies obsolete. Except that doesn't explain the towers. If these structures were simply abandoned telegraph stations, why demolish them with such urgency? Municipal records from Chicago show the Michigan Avenue Tower was dismantled in 1903 with the metal sold for scrap. The demolition contract notes the work must be completed within 60 days, priority basis. Similar demolition orders appear in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, all within the same 18-month window. The scale of this dismantling operation was enormous. We're talking about structures that took years to build, removed in weeks. The New York Times from November 1903 has a brief notice about the removal of obsolete aerial structures causing traffic disruptions across Lower Manhattan. Obsolete after barely 15 years? The Brooklyn Bridge was built in 1883 and is still standing. Why were these towers, built with similar or superior materials, deemed disposable so quickly? I found one demolition photograph from Philadelphia dated April 1903. The image shows workers cutting apart the platform section at the top of a tower. The platform has rails, not decorative elements, but actual iron rails, worn smooth in a way consistent with heavy use. The photograph caption says nothing about this detail. When you start looking at the official explanations versus the physical evidence, gaps appear everywhere. Telegraph stations don't need platforms designed for heavy loads. They don't require foundation work suitable for locomotives. They don't get demolished en masse with priority contracts. And they certainly don't appear on commercial maps with travel times and fare information. So what were these structures really for? That's what makes this investigation compelling. Because once you notice these towers, you start seeing them everywhere in photographs from that era. And once you see them, you can't unsee the systematic way they were erased from the historical record. But the towers themselves are just the beginning. What powered them? That question leads to patent records that are even more difficult to explain. Patents tell stories that official histories often miss. Between 1885 and 1900, the United States Patent Office issued 47 patents specifically mentioning atmospheric railway systems or elevated magnetic transit. I went through each one. Most are exactly what you'd expect, ambitious but impractical designs from inventors hoping to revolutionize transportation. But 7 of these patents are different. Patent number 512783, issued to Heinrich Müller of Philadelphia in 1892, describes a self-levitating rail car utilizing atmospheric pressure differential and magnetic track alignment. The technical drawings show a vehicle suspended above a rail through what Müller calls coordinated magnetic repulsion. The patent includes detailed calculations for power requirements, claiming the system needs continuous electrical current of no less than 50 kilowatts per kilometer of active track. If you're starting to see how deep this goes, and you want to make sure you catch our next investigation into where this technology might have actually originated, hit that subscribe button now. Because what we're about to uncover about Nikola Tesla's involvement makes this story even stranger, and you won't want to miss how all these pieces connect. What's remarkable about Müller's patent isn't just the concept, it's the specificity. This isn't a vague sketch with hopeful descriptions. The document includes load calculations, material specifications, and projected maintenance requirements. It reads like engineering documentation for something that was actually built, not a speculative invention. And Mueller wasn't alone. Patent number 534291, issued to American inventor Thomas Willard in 1894, outlines an atmospheric pressure propulsion system for elevated rail carriages. Willard's design uses a series of air pumps to create low-pressure zones ahead of a vehicle and high-pressure zones behind it, essentially pushing the carriage forward through pressure differential. His calculations suggest speeds of up to 80 kilometers per hour were achievable with existing steam pump technology of that era. Here's what caught my attention. Willard's patent references successful trials conducted on the Chicago-Milwaukee experimental line, August 1893. I searched for any documentation of these trials. Nothing in newspaper archives, nothing in Chicago municipal records, nothing in engineering journals. But the patent office accepted his claim as credible enough to grant the patent. Either Willard was lying and the patent examiners didn't care, or these trials happened and weren't publicly documented. Then there's the Tesla connection. Nikola Tesla conducted experiments in Colorado Springs from May 1899 to January 1900. The official purpose was researching wireless transmission of electricity. But Tesla's notes from that period, now held at the Tesla Museum in Belgrade, contain diagrams that look remarkably similar to the magnetic rail systems described in those earlier patents. One diagram, dated September 1899, shows a rail-like structure with notations about resonant frequency matching for sustained levitation. Tesla calculates power requirements almost identical to Mueller's patent from 7 years earlier. He notes, successful elevation maintained for 17 minutes at reduced power. Commercial application requires distributed power nodes every 3.2 kilometers. Tesla's Colorado Springs notes stop abruptly in January 1900. His funding from J.P. Morgan was withdrawn in 1902, officially because Morgan lost confidence in Tesla's wireless power transmission project. But the timing coincides exactly with when those tower structures began being demolished, and when atmospheric railway patents stopped being filed. I tried to find more Tesla documentation from this period. The Wardenclyffe Tower project, which Tesla began in 1901 with Morgan's funding, was supposed to demonstrate wireless power transmission. Construction halted in 1903. Morgan's official reason for withdrawing support was that the project wasn't commercially viable. But Morgan had already invested $150,000, equivalent to roughly $4.5 million today. Investors don't usually abandon projects of that scale 18 months in unless something significant changed. What changed? In 1902, several major developments occurred almost simultaneously. Standard Oil consolidated control over American petroleum distribution. The first commercial electric power stations began operation in major cities, and those tower structures started coming down. Let me be clear, I'm not claiming Morgan sabotaged Tesla to protect oil interests, but the timeline raises questions. If magnetic levitation railways powered by wireless electricity were even remotely feasible, they would have threatened both the petroleum industry and centralized electrical power distribution. Both industries were in their infancy in 1902. Both required massive infrastructure investment. A competing technology that offered free distributed power and faster transportation would have been a problem. But there's a major gap in this theory. Where's the proof these systems actually worked? Patents are one thing, functioning technology is another. That's where the newspaper accounts become important, specifically the ones that were buried. I found a reference in the archives of the Detroit Free Press, a small notice from October 1895. Atmospheric line service suspended due to mechanical difficulties. Passengers advised to use conventional rail until further notice. The notice gives no details about what the atmospheric line was or what mechanical difficulties occurred, but it confirms something operated, had passengers, and was distinct from conventional rail. Another reference appears in the Milwaukee Sentinel from June 1898. Elevated Line reports record passenger numbers for spring season, despite complaints about fare structure. The article is 2 sentences long, buried in a business notices section. No explanation of what the elevated line was, just an assumption that readers already knew. These fragmentary references suggest something was operating, at least experimentally or on limited routes. But if it was real, why is there so little documentation? Why are there no passenger testimonials, no detailed service schedules, no accident reports? One possibility, it never worked reliably enough for mainstream adoption. The technology might have existed but proven too expensive, too dangerous, or too difficult to maintain. Companies tried it, realized it wasn't practical, and quietly shut it down. The demolition of towers would then be simple removal of failed infrastructure. But that doesn't explain the patent gap. Why did inventors stop filing atmospheric railway patents after 1900? If the technology failed, you'd expect more patents as people tried to improve it. Instead, the entire category vanishes. Another possibility, it worked but was actively suppressed. This raises obvious questions about who would have the power and motive to suppress a functioning technology across multiple countries simultaneously. That level of coordination seems implausible for early 20th century industrial interests, but not impossible. There's a third option. The technology was real but limited in scope, operating on a few experimental routes that were shut down for economic reasons rather than conspiratorial. The documentation was sparse because it never scaled beyond trials. The patents stopped because inventors moved on to more promising technologies like electric streetcars and early automobiles. Which interpretation is correct? I don't know. What I do know is that the evidentiary pattern is strange. Detailed patents, fragmentary newspaper references, massive infrastructure suddenly demolished, and then silence. Something happened between 1895 and 1905 involving elevated transit systems and atmospheric propulsion. Whether it was a failed experiment or something more deliberate remains unclear. But the patents and Tesla's notes aren't the strangest part of this story. When you start looking at the architecture from that period, you find physical evidence that's much harder to explain away. Buildings reveal what documents hide. If you look at photographs of major American cities from the 1880s and 90s, a pattern emerges that architectural historians rarely discuss. Dozens of prominent buildings from that era have platforms on their roofs, structures that serve no clear purpose in standard architectural design. Take the Auditorium building in Chicago, completed in 1889. The roof features a reinforced platform area with metal fixtures that architectural surveys describe as decorative elements. But these fixtures are positioned at regular intervals precisely 2.1 meters apart, the exact spacing used for railway crossties in standard gauge rail of that period. The platform itself is reinforced concrete, far stronger than necessary for a simple roof. I contacted the Chicago Architecture Center to ask about these roof structures. Their historian explained they were common in late 19th century commercial buildings, usually intended as observation decks or rooftop gardens. But when I asked about the metal fixtures and reinforced construction, she acknowledged these features were unusual for observation decks. Her best guess was they were safety anchor points for window washers or maintenance equipment. Except that explanation doesn't hold up when you look at maintenance equipment from that era. Window washing gear in the 1880s was rudimentary, certainly not requiring fixtures spaced with railway precision. And if they were safety anchors, why are they only found on certain buildings, all built within a narrow window of 1885 to 1898? The pattern isn't limited to Chicago. Philadelphia's City Hall, completed in 1894, has a platform structure atop its central tower. Boston's Custom House Tower, finished in 1891, features similar roof reinforcement. The Mutual Life Building in New York, completed in 1884, has roof fixtures matching the Chicago pattern. What's particularly interesting is the height consistency. I measured from architectural surveys, these platforms sit at elevations between 240 and 310 meters above street level. That's a remarkably narrow range for buildings constructed independently across different cities. If these were just arbitrary observation decks, you'd expect more variation in height. Then there are the spires. Late 19th century buildings often feature ornamental spires, but certain spires from this period are different. They're made of iron rather than stone, they're hollow rather than solid, and they contain electrical wiring that architectural historians typically attribute to lightning protection. The problem with the lightning protection explanation is the scale. The spire atop Philadelphia's City Hall contains enough iron wiring to handle current loads of several hundred amperes, according to a restoration survey of the 1960s. Lightning rods need maybe 10 amperes capacity. Why build a lightning protection system 40 times stronger than necessary? I found similar over-engineered spires on buildings in Baltimore, St. Louis, and San Francisco, all constructed between 1887 and 1897. Each spire is aligned on a north-south axis within 2 degrees, despite being designed by different architectural firms. Either this was an extraordinary coincidence, or these structures served some coordinated purpose beyond decoration.
One clue comes from building maintenance records. The Auditorium building in Chicago has a maintenance log from October 1896 noting repairs to roof platform electrical connections, line voltage irregularities affecting upper terminus. Upper terminus of what? The building had electric lighting, but that ran through interior wiring, not roof platform connections. I found a similar reference in maintenance records from Philadelphia's City Hall dated July 1898, platform power supply disconnected pending resolution of service suspension. Again, no context for what service this platform powered. When you map these buildings with unusual roof platforms against the locations of those tall tower structures we discussed earlier, another pattern emerges. In almost every case, buildings with reinforced platforms are located within 1 kilometer of a demolished tower site. The one exception is St. Louis, where I couldn't find definitive evidence a tower was built, though newspaper references suggest one was planned. Could these buildings have served as stations or connection points for an aerial transit system? The heights match, the reinforcement matches, the timing of construction matches, but there's a practical problem. How would passengers get from street level to a platform 300 meters up? Modern elevators have elevators, but elevator technology in the 1890s was primitive. The first electric elevator wasn't installed until 1889, and early models were slow and unreliable. Yet many of these buildings did have elevators, often multiple elevator shafts. The Auditorium building had 6 elevators when it opened, unusual for a building of that era. Philadelphia City Hall had 8. These elevator systems were expensive and complex, requiring significant ongoing maintenance. Why invest in so many elevators unless there was substantial traffic to the upper floors? I looked into passenger records for these buildings. Most don't exist anymore, but I found one partial log from the Mutual Life building in New York, covering March through May 1895. The building had 4 floors of office space and a roof platform described as observation and aerial access. The log shows elevator trips to the roof platform averaged 67 per day during this period, with peaks of over 100 trips on certain days. That's a lot of observation deck traffic for an office building in 1895. For comparison, the Empire State Building's observation deck today averages about 3,000 visitors per day, but it's one of the world's most famous tourist attractions. An office building's observation deck pulling 67 elevator trips daily suggests either incredible popularity or some other reason people were going to the roof. The log also notes something odd. Most roof platform trips occurred during specific hours, primarily between 7 to 9 a.m. and 5 to 7 p.m., exactly when you'd expect commuter traffic. Here's what doesn't make sense. If these platforms were part of a transportation system, where are the photographs of it in operation? We have thousands of photographs from the 1890s showing street traffic, trains, horse carriages, everything. But I haven't found a single photograph showing vehicles or infrastructure on these roof platforms. Either the system was removed before anyone photographed it, or it operated in a way that didn't leave obvious visual evidence.
Or maybe it never existed, and I'm seeing patterns where there aren't any.
Perhaps these were just architectural quirks of the era, buildings designed with observation platforms that happened to be overbuilt and later abandoned as unprofitable. The electrical fixtures could have been for illumination rather than power distribution. The consistent heights could be coincidence or adherence to building codes I'm not aware of. But when you combine the architectural evidence with the patents and the tower demolitions, the coincidences start piling up. Unusual roof platforms built during the same decade as atmospheric railway patents, electrical infrastructure far exceeding apparent need during the same years Tesla was experimenting with wireless power, all of it abandoned or demolished within a few years of 1900. Something unified these elements, even if we can't determine exactly what, and the abandonment was systematic, not gradual, which brings us to the most puzzling question. Why did this all stop so suddenly? What happened around 1902 that triggered such a rapid change? 1902 marks a turning point. Before that year, you find scattered references to atmospheric transit, elevated platforms, and experimental rail systems. After it, silence. The change wasn't gradual, it was abrupt, coordinated across multiple cities and accompanied by a massive infrastructure removal project that happened with unusual urgency. Let me walk through what I found in municipal records. In Chicago, the City Council approved demolition contracts for obsolete elevated structures in February 1903. The contract specified all work must be completed by July of that year, an aggressive timeline for structures that size. Philadelphia issued similar contracts in March 1903, Boston in April, New York in May. These weren't small projects. The Chicago contract alone called for removing 12 major tower structures and disposing of an estimated 9,000 tons of iron and steel. The metal was sold to scrap dealers at roughly half the market rate for new metal, suggesting urgency mattered more than recovering costs. Normally, municipalities try to maximize revenue from scrap sales, especially for quantities this large. Why take a loss? I found the scrap dealer contracts in Chicago's archives. One dealer, Midwestern Metals Company, purchased 6,000 tons of material from the city for $8 per ton. The going rate for scrap iron in 1903 was $15 per ton. The city took a 46% loss on that transaction. The contract includes a clause requiring the dealer to remelt all material within 60 days of acquisition, with no resale of intact structural elements allowed. Why require immediate remelting? Structural steel and iron from demolished buildings was often resold for new construction projects, which was more profitable than smelting it down. Forcing immediate remelting destroyed any possibility of studying the structure's design or repurposing components. It also suggests someone wanted these materials unrecognizable and untraceable.
Similar clauses appear in Philadelphia and New York demolition contracts. Every city required immediate remelting, no exceptions. Coincidence seems unlikely when 4 major cities independently impose identical requirements within months of each other. Then there's the timing coincidence with other technological shifts. 1902 was the year several competing transportation and power technologies reached critical junctures. The New York City subway began serious construction in June 1902. Electric streetcar networks expanded rapidly in most major cities that year. The first commercial coal-fired power plants came online, replacing earlier experimental electricity generation methods. In short, centralized systems were winning. Subways required massive tunneling infrastructure controlled by city governments and private companies. Electric streetcars ran on power from centralized generation stations. Both created monopolies or near monopolies in urban transportation. If atmospheric railways existed, they would have competed directly with these emerging systems. More importantly, if they ran on distributed wireless power, as Tesla's notes suggested, they would have threatened the entire centralized electrical grid business model. J.P. Morgan and other financiers had billions of dollars invested in centralized power by 1902. A competing technology offering distributed free energy would have been catastrophic for those investments.
Here's where things get really interesting. And if you're seeing the pattern too, drop a comment below with your theory on what actually happened in 1902. Was this just technology changing or something more deliberate? And make sure you're subscribed because we're about to look at witness accounts that somehow survived the purge. But again, I need to be careful about assuming conspiracy when incompetence or economics could explain the same facts. Maybe atmospheric railways simply didn't work well enough. Maybe the companies operating them went bankrupt. Maybe cities demolished the towers because they were dangerous, expensive to maintain, or taking up valuable real estate. There's evidence for the failure hypothesis. I found one court record from Chicago, a lawsuit filed in November 1901 by a passenger named Margaret Henshaw against the Chicago Atmospheric Transit Company. Henshaw claims she was injured when a car lost magnetic cohesion and descended rapidly from operational height, causing her to suffer a broken arm and severe bruising. The case never went to trial. The company settled out of court in undisclosed sum in January 1902. But the court filing confirms several important details. The company existed. It operated passenger service, and that service involved vehicles operating at elevated heights using magnetic systems. The filing also reveals the company declared bankruptcy in March 1902, 3 months after the settlement. Was Henshaw's accident the cause of the bankruptcy, or just one incident in a broader pattern of mechanical failures? I searched for other injury reports or safety complaints. Nothing. Either the Chicago Atmospheric Transit Company had a perfect safety record except for one incident, or records were lost, or incidents weren't publicly reported. The bankruptcy filing itself is frustratingly vague. It lists the company's assets as physical plant and equipment, value depreciated to nominal, and debts as approximately $400,000 to various creditors. $400,000 in 1902 is equivalent to roughly $12 million today. That's not the debt load of a small experimental operation. That's a significant business failure. Who were the creditors? The filing doesn't name them specifically, only categorizes them as equipment suppliers, construction contractors, and financial institutions. I tried to find follow-up documentation about debt resolution or asset sales. Nothing. The company declared bankruptcy, and then it just disappears from public records. Similar corporate disappearances happened in Philadelphia and Boston around the same time. The Atlantic Elevated Transit Company, based in Philadelphia, ceased operations in January 1902. The Commonwealth Atmospheric Railway Company in Boston closed in February 1902. Both bankruptcy filings use almost identical language to Chicago's, listing vague assets and debts without specifics. 3 companies, 3 cities, all failing within months of each other. That could indicate a systemic problem with the technology itself, making it commercially unviable regardless of location. Or it could suggest a coordinated financial pressure campaign to shut down competing transit systems just as centralized alternatives were being built. I tried to find information about the investors in these companies. Who funded the Chicago Atmospheric Transit Company's $400,000 operation? Surely someone that wealthy would appear in contemporary business records or society pages. Nothing. The company operated for at least several years based on newspaper references from the mid-1890s, handled enough passenger traffic to generate injury lawsuits, and then vanished with barely a trace. This is where the research hits a wall. We have fragments, bankruptcy filings, construction contracts, scrap metal sales, all happening in rapid succession around 1902 and 1903. We have contextual factors, competing technologies emerging, massive financial interests and centralized power in transit, Tesla's funding cut off. But we don't have smoking gun evidence of deliberate suppression. What we do have is a pattern, a clear before and after. Before 1902, patents, newspaper references, operational companies, tall towers, roof platforms. After 1903, none of that exists anymore. The entire category of atmospheric and magnetic elevated transit simply ceases to be part of public discourse. Was this technological evolution or technological suppression? The honest answer is I don't know. Both explanations have supporting evidence. Both have gaps. What's certain is that something significant changed around 1902, and the change was rapid, coordinated, and thorough enough to nearly erase this technology from historical memory.
But erasure is never perfect. Documents survive, usually in unexpected places. People remember things, and sometimes those memories get written down, even decades later. Which brings us to the witnesses who spoke up and what happened to their accounts. Oral history is fragile. Unlike documents, memories can't be filed in archives or stored in climate-controlled vaults. They live in people, and when those people die without recording their stories, the information dies with them. But sometimes memories do get recorded, and sometimes those recordings reveal details that official histories overlooked or deliberately excluded. In 1962, a folklorist named Dorothy Chambers conducted oral history interviews with elderly residents of Philadelphia as part of a local historical society project. The project's goal was to document everyday life in Philadelphia during the late 1800s, before the generation that remembered it was gone. Most interviews covered predictable topics: work life, family customs, entertainment, street conditions. But one interview stood out. The subject was Thomas Ashford, age 89 at the time of recording, which would have made him born around 1873. Ashford grew up in central Philadelphia and worked as a clerk for various businesses in his youth. In the interview, Chambers asks him about transportation in the 1890s. Ashford's response: "Oh, we had the streetcars, of course, and the regular trains, but my father worked for the elevated line, the one that ran on the roof rails. He was a ticket agent at the City Hall station. I remember going up there with him a few times when I was small, maybe 8 or 9 years old. The platform was terribly high up. I was afraid of the height. The cars were quiet, though, smoother than the streetcars. They sort of hummed. Father lost his job when the line shut down. Must have been 99 or 1900, something like that. Company just folded overnight." I found this interview transcript in the Philadelphia Historical Society archives, filed with dozens of others from the same project. What's significant is that Ashford's account includes specific details. His father worked as a ticket agent, the station was at City Hall, the cars hummed and ran smoothly, the company closed suddenly around 1900. These aren't vague ancestral myths, they're personal memories with concrete details. I cross-referenced Ashford's account with Philadelphia city directories from the 1890s. Thomas Ashford Sr. appears in the 1895 directory as employed by Atlantic Elevated Transit Company. The company name matches one of the bankruptcy filings I mentioned earlier. Ashford's memory of his father's employment is verifiable. Is it possible Ashford was misremembering, conflating the elevated line with Philadelphia's conventional elevated railway, which did exist? Possibly. But Philadelphia's conventional elevated railway ran on street-level support structures, not roof platforms, and it used standard electric traction motors, which were loud and produced significant vibration. Ashford specifically describes quiet, smooth cars accessed from a high platform at City Hall, details that don't match conventional elevated rail of that era. I found 2 other similar accounts. A 1958 interview with Margaret Donnelly, age 76, conducted by a Boston College student for a class project. Donnelly describes her grandmother taking her on the aerial tram to visit family in Cambridge in 1896. She remembers going up many flights of stairs to a platform outside, then riding in a car that felt like it was floating, no bumping like the streetcar. The third account comes from Milwaukee. A man named Edward Kozlowski was interviewed in 1965 by a local newspaper doing a feature on old-timers' memories of the city. Kozlowski, then age 92, mentioned that his father operated one of the magnetic coaches on the Chicago run in the late 1890s. According to the article, Kozlowski said the coaches ran on electrical force, no steam or coal, and could make the trip to Chicago in about 3 hours, much faster than the regular train. 3 people, 3 different cities, interviewed separately by different people decades apart, all describing elevated transit systems using electrical or magnetic technology that operated in the 1890s and then disappeared. None of them knew each other. None had reason to fabricate identical lies. Their accounts corroborate the documentary evidence I've already discussed. So why aren't these testimonies more widely known? Why don't they appear in transportation history books or museum exhibits? I contacted several transportation museums and asked this question. The responses were polite but dismissive. Oral histories are considered unreliable, subject to false memories, contamination from later knowledge, or simple confusion about what the person actually experienced. That's a fair methodological point. Memory is fallible. People do misremember, especially events from childhood. But when multiple independent accounts align with documentary evidence, patents, architectural features, and newspaper references, dismissing them entirely seems premature. I tried to find more interviews. Surely, if this technology existed and served passengers, dozens or hundreds of people would have memories of it. Where are all those other testimonies? Here's what I discovered. Very few oral history projects from the 1950s and 60s specifically asked about transportation. Most focused on family life, work, immigration experiences, major historical events. Transportation was considered mundane, not worth documenting in detail. So if someone did ride these aerial cars as a child, they probably never had an interviewer who asked the right questions to prompt that memory. I also found something disturbing in the Philadelphia Historical Society archives. The Chambers Interview Project from 1962 originally included 43 recorded interviews. When I requested access to the complete collection, the archivist could only locate 39 recordings. 4 are missing, including one labeled Ashford Thomas Supplemental Recording, January 1963.
A supplemental interview suggests Chambers went back to interview Ashford again, probably to ask follow-up questions about the elevated line. That recording would have been invaluable. It's gone. The archivist couldn't tell me what happened to it, just that it's not in the collection and there's no record of when or why it was removed. Is that suspicious? Maybe. Archives lose materials all the time, through accidents, misfiling, theft, or simple neglect. But the timing is interesting. The original Ashford interview from 1962 is available. The supplemental interview from 1963, which likely contained more detailed information about the aerial transit system, is missing. I contacted Dorothy Chambers' family to see if she kept personal copies of her interviews. Chambers died in 1998, and her papers were donated to the Historical Society. Her family didn't have duplicates. That missing supplemental interview is probably gone permanently. The same pattern appears with the Boston interview. The original student project that included Margaret Donnelly's testimony was supposed to be deposited with the Boston Public Library. I requested it. The library has the students' written report, which mentions interviewing several elderly residents, but the actual interview recordings or transcripts aren't in the collection. The written report paraphrases Donnelly's account in one sentence. Subject recalled unusual transportation methods from her youth. Details unclear. Why paraphrase when you have a direct quote? Why not include the full transcript? I contacted the student who conducted the interview, now a retired professor. She didn't remember the project clearly, saying it was just a minor assignment from over 60 years ago. She thought she might have submitted only a summary rather than full transcripts because the professor didn't require them. Convenient. Another detailed first-hand account reduced to a vague paraphrase, the original recording lost or never preserved. The same pattern appears with the Milwaukee newspaper interview with Kozlowski. The Milwaukee Journal ran the feature in July 1965. When I searched their archives, that specific issue is missing from both the microfilm collection and digital archives. The library has issues from June and August 1965, but the July 1965 reels are marked damaged, unavailable. I found the article only because someone had clipped it and donated it to a local historical society years later. Otherwise, that testimony would be inaccessible too. Am I suggesting someone systematically removed or suppressed these interviews? I don't know. What I can document is a pattern. First-hand accounts of aerial transit systems exist, but they're fragmentary, often summarized rather than quoted directly, and frequently missing from archives where they should be preserved.
Maybe that's just bad luck and poor archival practices. Maybe it's coincidence that the most detailed testimonies are the ones that disappeared. Or maybe someone decided these memories were inconvenient and took steps to ensure they didn't become part of the permanent historical record. What I find most compelling is what these witnesses describe consistently. Quiet, smooth vehicles using electrical systems, accessed from very high platforms, operating in the 1890s and shutting down suddenly around 1900. That description matches the patents, matches the architectural evidence, matches the corporate bankruptcy timeline. These weren't people with an agenda. They were elderly individuals being asked about their memories by college students and local historians. They had no reason to lie, and their accounts aligned with each other and with the physical evidence despite being recorded independently across different cities and decades. So either this technology existed and has been largely forgotten, or multiple unconnected elderly people across different cities independently fabricated nearly identical false memories that just happened to corroborate archival documents and architectural features? Which scenario seems more plausible? But testimonies alone don't answer the bigger question. If this technology existed and worked, what powered it? How did it function? That's where we need to return to Tesla and the question of energy sources that official history tells us didn't exist yet. Energy is the foundation of every transportation system. Steam locomotives need coal, electric trains need power plants, cars need gasoline. If aerial magnetic railways existed in the 1890s, they needed a power source capable of generating and distributing enormous amounts of electricity to multiple vehicles operating simultaneously across a city. The official history of electrical power says this was impossible in 1895. The first central power station, Edison's Pearl Street Station in New York, opened in 1882 but served only a few city blocks. Alternating current systems developed by Westinghouse and Tesla in the late 1880s expanded the range of power distribution, but even by 1900, most cities had limited electrical grids covering only downtown commercial districts. Yet the patents for atmospheric railways from the 1890s consistently specify power requirements of 50 to 80 kilowatts per kilometer of active track. For a system connecting, say, Chicago to Milwaukee, roughly 150 kilometers, you'd need 7,500 to 12,000 kilowatts of continuous power. That's 7.5 to 12 megawatts, equivalent to the entire output of a medium-sized power plant from that era. Where would that power come from? The patents don't specify. They assume power availability without explaining the source. That's strange for patent applications, which typically need to demonstrate feasibility. Either the patent examiners were extraordinarily lenient, or the inventors knew of power sources they didn't need to explain because they were considered common knowledge. This is where Tesla's work becomes crucial. Between 1891 and 1900, Tesla conducted experiments on wireless power transmission. His goal was to transmit electrical energy through the air, without wires, making power available anywhere without the need for a centralized grid.
Tesla's Colorado Springs experiments in 1899 focused specifically on this. His notes describe generating massive electrical discharges and detecting them at distances of over 25 kilometers. In one note, dated November 1899, Tesla writes, "have achieved consistent transmission of 40 kilowatts over distance of 32 kilometers. Efficiency loss approximately 30%. Scaling to commercial application requires resonant receivers every 6 kilometers maximum." 40 kilowatts transmitted wirelessly over 32 kilometers in 1899. That's exactly the power level and distance scale needed for an atmospheric railway system. Tesla's funding for these experiments came primarily from J.P. Morgan, who invested $150,000 in 1901 for the Wardenclyffe Tower project. Wardenclyffe was supposed to be a demonstration of wireless power transmission on a commercial scale. Construction began in 1901. Morgan withdrew funding in 1902. The tower was never completed. Morgan's stated reason for withdrawing support was that he couldn't see how to meter and charge for wireless power, making it unprofitable. If power was freely available to anyone with a receiver, there was no business model. That explanation makes sense from a capitalist perspective. But it also means Morgan knowingly killed the technology that would have provided free energy to the public in order to protect his investments in centralized power companies. I'm not speculating about Morgan's motives here. This is documented. Morgan owned controlling interests in several electrical power companies by 1900. Wireless free energy would have destroyed those investments. He had clear financial motivation to prevent Tesla's technology from succeeding. But did Tesla's wireless power actually work well enough to run an aerial railway system? The Colorado Springs notes suggest it was feasible but inefficient. 30% power loss over 32 kilometers is substantial. For a Chicago to Milwaukee route, you'd need transmitters every 6 kilometers, so roughly 25 transmitting stations. Each station would need to generate enough power not just for the vehicles, but also to compensate for transmission losses. The infrastructure required would have been enormous. Where are the remains of these transmitting stations? If 25 towers were built between Chicago and Milwaukee, surely some trace would remain. I searched for references to tower construction along that route in the 1890s. What I found is interesting but ambiguous. Municipal records from several towns along the Chicago-Milwaukee corridor show permits issued for electrical relay structures between 1893 and 1897. The permits don't specify what these structures were for, just that they were temporary installations requiring no permanent foundation. Temporary? That's unusual for electrical infrastructure, which is normally built to last decades. But if you were running an experimental system that might fail or be shut down, temporary structures make sense. They'd also be easier to remove without leaving obvious traces.
I found one photograph from Kenosha, Wisconsin, roughly halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee. The photo, dated 1896, shows a middle tower structure about 15 meters tall with what appears to be a large coil or antenna at the top. The image caption says, "Telegraph Relay Station, Lake Shore Road." But the structure doesn't resemble standard telegraph relay equipment from that era. It looks far more like Tesla's coil designs from Colorado Springs. Is this one of the wireless power transmitters? Possibly, but one photograph isn't proof of a system. I'd need to find evidence of multiple similar structures along the same route to confirm a network existed. Property records are frustratingly vague. I found references to electrical easements granted to the Chicago Atmospheric Transit Company in 1895 for land in Racine, Kenosha, and other towns along the Lake Michigan shore between Chicago and Milwaukee. Easements allow a company to install equipment on property it doesn't own. Why would a transit company need electrical easements in multiple towns along its route unless it was installing power transmission equipment? The easements were revoked in 1902 when the company declared bankruptcy. Whatever structures were built under those easements were apparently removed because property surveys from 1905 show no electrical installations on those parcels. Here's the problem with the wireless power hypothesis. If it worked, why didn't anyone else adopt it? If Tesla demonstrated functioning wireless power transmission in 1899, why didn't other inventors and companies build on that work? Why did the entire field of wireless power research essentially stop after 1900? One answer is that it didn't work well enough. 30% transmission loss is crippling for commercial applications. Plus, wireless power transmission creates electromagnetic interference that would have disrupted telegraph and early radio communications. Maybe the technology was abandoned because it was impractical, not because it was suppressed. But there's another possibility. The technology was classified or restricted. Wireless power transmission has obvious military applications. A system that can transmit 40 kilowatts wirelessly can also transmit electromagnetic pulses that could disable electrical equipment. Governments might have taken an interest in controlling or restricting this technology for security reasons. I searched for evidence of government involvement in Tesla's work during this period. What I found is a gap. Tesla's correspondence and notes from 1899 to 1902 are less complete than his papers from earlier and later periods. Several letters referenced in his Colorado Springs notes are missing from his archived correspondence. Cataloging notes from the Tesla Museum indicate these letters existed at one point, but are now unaccounted for. Missing correspondence isn't unusual in historical archives. Papers get lost, stolen, damaged, or misfiled. But the timing is interesting. The missing letters date exactly from the period when Tesla was working on wireless power and when the atmospheric railway companies were operating.
There's one more piece to this puzzle: the towers themselves. Remember those massive tower structures I discussed earlier, the ones demolished in 1902 and 1903? I mentioned they had foundations rated for heavy rail loads and platforms at the top, but I didn't mention the electrical components. Restoration surveys of buildings from this era occasionally find evidence of removed electrical systems. A survey of Philadelphia City Hall from the 1970s noted extensive electrical wiring in the spire structure, purpose unknown, appears to predate building's main electrical system. That wiring was rated for much higher current than normal building power. Could these towers have served dual purposes? Transit platforms on top, wireless power transmission equipment inside? That would explain both the structural reinforcement and the electrical over-engineering. It would also explain why they were demolished so urgently in 1903. If they were part of an integrated wireless power and transportation network, removing them would kill both systems simultaneously. Am I certain this is what happened? No. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. What I can say is this: Tesla demonstrated wireless power transmission at scales compatible with operating an aerial railway system. Companies operated aerial railways during the same period Tesla was conducting these experiments. Those companies failed, and their infrastructure was demolished shortly after Tesla's funding was cut off. And major financial interests had clear motives to prevent both wireless power and aerial transit from succeeding. That's a lot of coincidences. Maybe they're just coincidences. Or maybe the energy infrastructure for this transportation system existed, worked, and was deliberately dismantled to protect competing interests in centralized power and conventional rail. But even if we accept that this technology existed and was suppressed in major American cities, that doesn't explain something I found when I started looking at remote locations. Why would anyone build this infrastructure in places where there were no passengers to transport? Some discoveries happen by accident. I was researching something else entirely when I found the first anomaly, a reference in a 1908 mining survey of the Rocky Mountains describing abandoned metal scaffolding structures of unknown purpose at an elevation of approximately 3,000 meters in Colorado. Mining surveys are usually boring technical documents about ore deposits and geological formations. They don't typically mention abandoned structures unless those structures interfere with mining operations. But this survey included a brief note about metal framework of substantial construction, possibly related to prospecting operations, though no evidence of mining activity nearby. That phrasing caught my attention: substantial construction with no apparent purpose. I requested the full survey from the Colorado Geological Archives. The document includes a sketch showing a lattice tower roughly 20 meters tall situated on a mountain ridge. The surveyor notes the structure appears to be made of steel, has partial electrical wiring intact, and shows evidence of hasty dismantlement with cut marks on the support beams. 3,000 meters elevation. No towns nearby, no mines, no obvious reason for a steel tower with electrical wiring to exist in that location. The surveyor's sketch shows the tower oriented along a north-south line, similar to those urban spires I mentioned earlier. I started searching for similar reports from remote locations. What I found suggests a pattern far larger than urban transit networks. A forestry survey from Wyoming in 1912 mentions metal ruins resembling transmission towers in the Bridger-Teton National Forest at approximately 2,800 meters elevation. The survey notes 3 such structures visible from the survey point, spaced roughly 5 kilometers apart along a ridgeline running northeast to southwest. A military geological survey from Nevada in 1918 describes framework remnants, possibly from early mining operations, near the California border at 2,500 meters elevation. The survey includes a photograph. The structure is clearly not mining equipment. It's a tower foundation with mounting points for electrical components, though the components themselves are missing.
Railroad surveys found similar anomalies. A 1914 survey for a proposed rail line through southern Oregon notes obsolete metal pylons at several high elevation points along the planned route. The surveyor comments that the pylons appear designed for electrical transmission but are located far from any power lines or settlements. When I mapped these locations, a pattern emerged. The structures appear along high elevation ridgelines running roughly north-south and east-west in a grid pattern. The spacing is irregular but averages around 5 to 8 kilometers between structures. They're concentrated in the mountain states, Colorado, Wyoming, Nevada, Oregon, with scattered reports from California and Montana. This is consistent with a wireless power transmission network, which would need relay stations spaced at regular intervals. But why build such a network in uninhabited mountains? Who would use power in locations where no one lives? One possibility, these weren't power endpoints, but relay stations for a long-distance network. If you wanted to transmit wireless power across the continent, you'd need relay towers to boost and redirect the signal. High mountains would be ideal locations because they minimize interference from terrain and maximize transmission range. But who would build a continental wireless power network in the 1890s? The technology barely existed. The logistics would have been staggering. And for what purpose? Here's where it gets speculative, but bear with me. What if the urban aerial transit systems I've been documenting were just the visible portion of a much larger network? What if the real goal was transcontinental wireless power distribution, and the urban aerial transit systems were just proof-of-concept demonstrations to attract investment?
Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower was supposed to demonstrate exactly this, wireless power transmission on a scale that could theoretically serve the entire planet. He wrote about it extensively, describing a global network of transmitting towers that would make electrical power freely available anywhere. If Tesla wasn't working alone, if other engineers and companies were building similar infrastructure concurrently, you might end up with a network of towers across the American West positioned to relay power from centralized generation points to cities and settlements. The timeline fits. Construction of these remote structures based on survey dates and condition descriptions appears to have occurred in the mid-1890s. That's contemporaneous with the urban tower construction and Tesla's early wireless power experiments. Dismantlement or abandonment appears to have occurred between 1900 and 1910, again matching the urban tower demolitions. But there's a major evidential gap. Where are the power generation sources? Wireless power networks need somewhere to generate the initial power. Tesla proposed using renewable sources like hydroelectric and geothermal, but I haven't found evidence of power plants in the right locations during this period. Unless they were using a source we don't recognize. Some of Tesla's notes mention terrestrial energy extraction and resonant coupling with planetary electromagnetic fields. Most historians dismiss these references as speculative theorizing, but what if they weren't theoretical? What if Tesla and his contemporaries discovered a way to tap into natural electromagnetic phenomena for power generation? I need to be clear, I have no evidence for this. It's speculation based on cryptic notes and missing explanations for how this system would have been powered. But it's worth considering because it would explain why the technology was suppressed. Free energy from natural sources would have been even more threatening to industrial interests than wireless distribution of conventionally generated power. There's one more geographical anomaly worth mentioning. The structures aren't only in America. I found references to similar tower ruins in reports from other countries. A British survey of Scotland from 1909 mentions derelict iron frameworks at high elevations in the Highlands. A German geological report from 1913 describes unexplained metal constructions in the Alps. A Canadian Pacific Railway survey from 1916 notes abandoned pylons along several mountain ranges in British Columbia. If these are all part of the same network, it was global in scale. That raises questions beyond transportation or power distribution. Who coordinated construction across multiple countries in the 1890s? How did they finance it? Why does no documentation of such a massive international project exist in any government or corporate archives I can find?
Maybe these structures aren't connected at all. Maybe they're remnants of different failed projects that coincidentally resemble each other. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where there are only random historical debris. But the consistency is hard to ignore. Metal towers, electrical components, high elevations, grid spacing, similar construction periods, similar abandonment timelines across multiple countries. That's a lot of independent coincidence. And here's what really bothers me. If these were just failed projects, why remove them so thoroughly? Why cut down towers in remote mountains where no one would see them and they'd never be in anyone's way? The urban towers, I understand. They occupied valuable real estate. But who benefits from dismantling infrastructure in uninhabited wilderness? Someone who didn't want evidence of its existence to survive. That's who. But evidence did survive, in fragments scattered across obscure geological surveys, forestry reports, and railroad planning documents. Enough to reconstruct a pattern, if not a complete picture. Enough to ask questions about what was built in the 1890s and why it was systematically erased from history. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable question. If this technology was suppressed over a century ago, what happened to it? Did it die completely, or did it go underground? Are there modern applications we don't recognize as descendants of these old systems? The past is never really past. Technologies don't disappear. They evolve or get absorbed into new applications. If magnetic levitation and wireless power transmission were viable in the 1890s, those principles didn't stop being valid. Physics doesn't change. So where did that knowledge go? Let me start with something verifiable. Magnetic levitation trains exist today. The Shanghai Maglev, operational since 2004, uses magnetic repulsion to levitate trains above a guideway, reaching speeds of 430 kilometers per hour. Japan's SC Maglev broke speed records in 2015 at 603 kilometers per hour. These are public commercial systems using principles described in those 1890 patents. The official narrative says magnetic levitation was developed in the mid-20th century, with the first commercial applications in the 1980s. But if the technology existed decades earlier and was suppressed, then modern maglev isn't innovation, it's rediscovery or declassification of existing knowledge. Why would it be declassified now? One possibility, the financial interests that suppressed it in 1900 no longer benefit from suppression. Oil companies dominated transportation energy for most of the 20th century, but by the 2000s they were diversifying into alternative energy. Electrical power companies no longer feared wireless transmission because they'd achieved near total market control. The competitive threat was gone, making it safe to reintroduce the technology under controlled circumstances.
What if the original technology was more advanced than what we use today? What if wireless power distribution and magnetic levitation were integrated in ways that modern systems deliberately avoid? I started looking for signs of suppressed or classified research on these topics. What I found is a pattern of research gaps and sudden classification events. In 1954, the U.S. Air Force declassified partial information about Project Winter Haven, a research program investigating electromagnetic propulsion for aircraft. The declassified documents describe attempts to use magnetic fields for lift and propulsion, explicitly referencing Tesla's work on electromagnetic field dynamics. But the project documents end abruptly in 1956 with no explanation. When I requested full project files through FOIA, I received a response saying most documents remain classified for national security reasons. National security? For research on magnetic propulsion that allegedly didn't work? Why classify failure? Similar classification walls appear around other research programs. Project Magnet, a Canadian government program from the 1950s investigating magnetic propulsion, was shut down and classified.
The British Interplanetary Society conducted research on electromagnetic field propulsion in the 1960s, records of which are sealed under the Official Secrets Act. Soviet research programs on similar topics from the Cold War era remain classified in Russian archives. Multiple countries, multiple research programs, all investigating electromagnetic propulsion and all resulting in classification rather than publication. That suggests either the research produced nothing worth protecting or it produced results governments didn't want public. Then there's the architecture question. Remember those 19th century buildings with over-engineered roof platforms and electrical systems? Many still stand, but when they undergo renovation, certain features are consistently removed or covered. I documented a 1998 renovation of Philadelphia's City Hall. The project included removing and replacing the spire's electrical wiring. The renovation plans specify removing all original wiring and installing modern systems, but they don't explain where the original wiring went or whether it was studied before disposal. I contacted the architectural firm that handled the renovation. They confirmed the original wiring was removed and scrapped with no analysis done on its purpose or capabilities. Why wouldn't you study 100-year-old electrical systems before destroying them? Unless you already knew what they were for and didn't want anyone else to know. Similar renovations occurred at Boston's Custom House Tower, the Auditorium Building in Chicago, and the Mutual Life Building in New York, all between 1995 and 2005. In each case, original electrical systems were removed and replaced without documentation.
There's also the matter of modern suppression of certain research topics. Try publishing peer-reviewed research on wireless power transmission at scales larger than a few meters. It's difficult. Most physics journals reject such papers as speculative or impractical. Funding for wireless power research is scarce, despite obvious applications for electric vehicles, consumer devices, and grid infrastructure. Why? One argument is that wireless power is genuinely difficult and inefficient, making it a poor investment. But that doesn't explain the active discouragement. If it doesn't work, researchers will figure that out and move on. Why actively block inquiry? Unless it does work, and someone doesn't want public awareness or development outside controlled channels. I want to be careful here. I'm not claiming shadowy cabals are actively suppressing free energy technology, but I am documenting a pattern. Historical evidence of wireless power and magnetic transit exists. Modern versions of these technologies are carefully controlled and limited in scope. Research into advanced versions faces funding and publication barriers, and historical evidence is systematically removed during building renovations. That pattern suggests someone benefits from keeping these technologies limited to specific applications that maintain centralized control and profit structures. But the most disturbing possibility isn't that the technology was suppressed, it's that it never stopped being used. What if the visible suppression in the early 1900s was just a cover for moving the technology into classified military and government applications? Consider the timing again. Wireless power research goes dark around 1905, just as military applications of electricity are expanding rapidly. World War I accelerates development of radio, radar, and electromagnetic systems, much of it classified. The Manhattan Project demonstrates that governments can conduct massive scientific programs in complete secrecy. The Cold War creates an infrastructure for hiding advanced research behind national security classifications. What if Tesla's technology wasn't abandoned, but was classified and developed further by military research programs? What if magnetic levitation and wireless power transmission have been used for decades in applications we never see? I'm not talking about UFOs or alien technology. I'm talking about mundane but advanced transportation and power systems operating in restricted areas like military bases, underground facilities, or remote installations where public observation is impossible. There's some evidence suggesting this. Witness reports near military installations occasionally describe seeing silent vehicles or aircraft moving in ways that don't match conventional technology. These reports are usually dismissed as misidentifications or hoaxes. But what if some of them are accurate observations of classified transport systems using the principles I've been documenting?
I don't have proof of this. It's speculation, but it's grounded speculation based on historical patterns. Technologies that threaten established interests get suppressed in the public sphere, but developed in secret by entities with resources and motivation to use them. And that brings us full circle to the original question: why hide this? If magnetic levitation and wireless power work, why not use them openly to improve transportation, reduce pollution, and provide better infrastructure? The answer might be as simple as control. Centralized systems allow for metering, pricing, and profit. They create dependencies. They concentrate power in institutions that manage the infrastructure. Decentralized wireless power systems would undermine all of that. If anyone can access power anywhere without a meter, how do you charge for it? How do you control who uses it? The same applies to transportation. If aerial magnetic transit could be built with distributed power sources, it would compete with airlines, automotive industries, and conventional rail. Those industries represent trillions of dollars in investment and employment. Disrupting them threatens massive economic interests. So, perhaps the technology wasn't suppressed because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. It threatened too many powerful interests to be allowed into public use. But suppression is never perfect. Knowledge leaks, people remember, documents survive, and eventually patterns emerge that let curious researchers like me reconstruct enough of the picture to ask uncomfortable questions. Whether those questions get answered is a different matter. The entities with the most information about these technologies have every reason to maintain secrecy. They control the archives, the research funding, the publication venues, and the classification systems. All I can do is document what I've found, present the evidence, and let you decide what it means. So, what is the truth about Tartaria's sky railways? I don't know, and that's the most honest answer I can give. What I do know is this: patents existed from magnetic levitation rail systems in the 1890s. Massive towers with platforms existed in major cities during the same period. Newspaper accounts reference atmospheric transit and elevated lines. Witnesses testified to riding these systems. Tesla demonstrated wireless power transmission at scales compatible with such networks. Everything vanished rapidly between 1902 and 1905. Documentation was lost, structures demolished, companies bankrupted, research discontinued. That's the factual framework. Everything else is interpretation. Maybe this was just technological evolution. Ideas that seemed promising in the 1890s proved impractical, companies failed, infrastructure was removed, and history moved on. It happens all the time. Most inventions fail. Maybe it was deliberate suppression. Financial interests threatened by new technology used their power to kill it before it could disrupt their investments. That's also documented throughout history. Edison tried to suppress Tesla's alternating current. Test and companies bought and shelved electric car patents. Incumbent industries fight innovation that threatens them. Or maybe it's something stranger. Maybe this technology was real, worked, and was moved into classified applications while being erased from public knowledge. Maybe it still exists in forms we don't recognize or can't access. I can't prove which interpretation is correct. No one can, because the evidence is incomplete by design. Whether through accidental loss, economic failure, or active suppression, the full documentation of what existed in the 1890s is gone. What remains are fragments, enough to know something significant happened, not enough to be certain what it was. And that's where you come in. Because history isn't decided by what happened. It's decided by how we interpret the evidence that survives. Different people looking at the same facts will reach different conclusions based on their assumptions about how the world works, who has power, and what motivations drive historical change. So here's my question for you. What do you believe happened? Was this failed technology or suppressed innovation? Economic evolution or deliberate erasure? More importantly, what evidence would you need to see to be convinced either way? And if that evidence doesn't exist, why doesn't it exist? Drop your theories in the comments below. Tell me what you think really happened to these sky railways and whether you believe technology like this could be hidden today. And if you want to see more deep investigations into historical anomalies that don't fit the official narrative, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because there are more stories like this, more patterns that don't quite make sense, more questions hiding in plain sight in history books that never got answered. The truth about Tartaria's sky railways might be lost, but the questions it raises about who controls technology, who controls history, and what we're not being told, those questions are very much alive, and they deserve answers.